my name is Dr. Robert Chouanière. I'm the Executive Director of Ignatian Encounter Ministry, and I'd like to welcome you back to this second session in our basic course for Conversation in the Spirit Facilitators. This session is on the role of the facilitator in the Conversation in the Spirit process. So let's get started. The role of the facilitator is a central and critical role for Conversations in the Spirit. Facilitators are really at the heart of this process and the heart of the wider synodal conversion within the life of the church as we seek to listen more deeply to one another to discern the will of God for our communities and for ourselves as disciples. First of all, Conversation in the Spirit facilitators help to model the conversation experience for others. Here's an example of a small group conversation in the Spirit without a facilitator. Take a look.
Hi, everybody.
Hey, hi.
Were we supposed to answer a question or something, or I'm not really sure.
Are we all here? Is this everybody?
I don't know.
There was going to be a question, but I don't know what the question is.
Yeah, I don't remember.
I didn't
I
write
think it was in
down.
my
I'm
email
not sure
somewhere.
either.
I'm
I don't
gonna
know what's going on.
I don't want to be the facilitator, so.
As you can see, as is often the case, when people are put into small groups and there's no designated facilitator, the first thing that happens is we have to determine who's going to be the facilitator. This takes time and also immediately establishes some dynamic within the conversation because we have to select someone from this group of strangers that we don't know. Also, people are unfamiliar with the process or the model, so even if the facilitator is chosen, that facilitator may not feel comfortable with the ground rules of the conversation, how to move the conversation forward, how to select different people, how to establish an order for the conversation, and how to ensure, most importantly, that everyone feels safe and comfortable within the conversation. Facilitators help to do all of this. They help to model the conversation process and make everyone feel safe and comfortable, which is another of the primary roles that the facilitator plays, to create a safe, welcoming, and inviting space for encounter. So that when people come into the small group, whether that be a virtual group or an in-person group, they feel that this is a safe environment, that they're welcomed into the environment, that they belong there. The facilitator also helps to ensure that there is equity within the process. There are times that people have an opportunity to speak. Sometimes it's 3 minutes or 4 minutes or 2 minutes. The facilitator helps to keep that time and thereby helps to ensure equity within the process. Next, it's important to note that the conversation model moves from the I to the we. We move from individual experience to a collective group experience, a more collaborative exercise. The I experiences are very important. It's important to share our individual experience that we've reflected upon before we've come to the conversation. But what you'll notice is as you move through the movements and rounds of the conversation, that we move towards a collaborative group work where everyone is seeking to discern what the Holy Spirit is trying to say to us through this conversation. So those who were strangers when they enter the conversation become collaborators by the end of the conversation as they move the fruit of their conversation forward. And we'll see how that happens. Oftentimes there are tensions that emerge within the conversation. Not everyone is going to agree with one another, and that's fine, that's expected. We can have tensions within the conversation, and the facilitator helps to hold those tensions by abiding by the ground rules and ensuring that everyone else does. Pope Francis has said that tensions are helpful. They help us to understand the dynamics and the passions within our conversations, within these important topics that we're discussing. But he urges us to avoid conflict, where we stop looking at each other as people with dignity and start looking at each other as forces that we need to conquer. The facilitator helps to ensure that we all see ourselves with equal human dignity while allowing for tensions within the conversation to emerge and not to have to find quick or easy resolutions to those tensions. Because oftentimes, if we're honest, there are no easy answers. But we need to allow that tension to exist so that we can continue to walk together until we find a resolution or that's revealed to us by the Spirit. And finally, an important role that the facilitator plays is holding space for the Holy Spirit. There are times within the conversations where there's silence, where we especially want the Spirit to move within the group. But also, as you consider the space that you're in, is there maybe a candle behind you? Is there a safe, prayerful environment where people can feel welcome. You also help through your demeanor to create this safe, welcoming, and prayerful environment, and creating a space for the Holy Spirit to be present within the conversation. So let's talk more specifically about what the facilitator does within the conversation. First of all, your role as facilitator is to accompany a group of between 5 to 7 people in a 60-minute conversation in the Spirit. This can be an individual conversation that happens just within one small group, or it can be part of a larger virtual assembly or a larger group assembly. But usually the groups work when you have between 5 and 7 participants. It's important to note that typically facilitators do not participate within the rounds of conversation. You have a lot of work to do. You'll be facilitating the conversation, keeping time, taking notes, and usually the facilitator should remain neutral within the conversation topic itself. You're fully participating within the conversation as the facilitator. And again, typically the conversation is about 1 hour, though it can be extended by about another 10 minutes for note-taking that we'll talk about in a minute. The first thing the facilitator does is to welcome everyone and create that prayerful space and environment. And first of all, to establish the order of the speakers. So as in contrast to the first clip that we saw, the facilitator helps to establish that order at the very, very beginning so that the conversation continues to move in an easy fashion. We do provide a script for the conversation, and that's included in the resource materials along with this course. That script can be adapted and new questions can be inputted, but the basic rounds of the conversation are there. I would encourage you in your conversations in any environment to follow that script to the extent that it helps. It provides an introduction to the conversation, explains the conversation model to the participants, takes you through the rounds, and also provides a note-taking or evaluation session of the conversation. We also provide ground rules, which is another resource PDF that's offered through this course. The guidelines, or ground rules as we say, help to keep the conversation on track. The ground rules are critical to a conversation in the Spirit. This is a structured conversation. There's periods of listening and periods of speaking, and everyone should understand that. So here are the ground rules that we offer at the beginning of our conversations, and we ask everyone in the conversation to affirm that. The first ground rule is that everyone in the conversation is expected to participate. Everyone is a participant in the conversation. There's no one in the conversation that can say, hey, you know what, I'm just here to listen. I really don't feel like speaking today. Everyone is expected to show up and to participate in the conversation. There are no observers to the conversation. Even you as a facilitator are fully engaged in the conversation through your participation and through your facilitation. So everyone is active within the conversation. Most importantly, and a central ground rule for the conversations in the Spirit process is that only one person speaks at a time. Next, there is no crosstalk or interruption when someone is speaking. Oftentimes people want to jump into the conversation. Sometimes this can even be affirmative, like, oh, I really hear you. Oh yeah, I felt like that once too. Or I feel so badly about that. That happened to you. Even this kind of affirming conversation is really discouraged. Everyone has an opportunity to speak and to speak freely without interruption. Even if you don't like what the person is saying, trust me, they're going to be finished in 3 minutes. You can get through it. It's important, though, that everyone has their time to speak and can speak fully. Time limits are respected within the conversation. This helps to ensure the equity of the conversation so that no one person dominates the conversation and no one is left out of the conversation. You, as the facilitator, help to keep the time. So facilitators provide a 30-second warning. Oftentimes within the conversations, what I will do, if it's a virtual conversation, for instance, is I will have a red card, and I'll let people know at 30 seconds, I'm going to share this card over, and it's going to come over my little picture, and you're going to see that, and you'll know that that's 30 seconds. There are other facilitators I know that use an actual card that says 30 seconds. You simply want to let people know that their time is coming to a close. When the time is up, you do want to alert them to that. Some people use a bell, some people call out time. You can let people finish their thoughts, but it's important to let people know that their time is up and we need to move on to the next person. And everyone has agreed through the ground rules that they will respect those time limits. The final ground rule is that all conversations are confidential. It's important that people feel safe within the conversation, and this confidentiality helps to achieve that. People are not expected to talk about what happened in the conversation or what was revealed in the conversation, and people need to feel sure about that. Finally, everyone is responsible for their sharing within the conversation. What I mean by this is that if people should not feel that they need to speak any more deeply than they're prepared to speak. So if one person shares a very deep and painful story about their experience, there's no expectation that the person that goes after them needs to share at that depth or that level if they're not prepared to do so themselves. Everyone should be responsible for their own sharing and not feel that they're being forced to share in a way that makes them too vulnerable in that moment. So those are our ground rules and the guidelines that we'll announce before the conversation ever begins. If you're in a virtual environment in a large group assembly, these ground rules will be shared before you even get into your small group. So don't feel that you have the responsibility to announce those ground rules. They'll be shared with a large group beforehand. Next, facilitators are also the timekeepers. This role could be shared. You could have a separate timekeeper within the event, but most often, the facilitators will also be the timekeepers. You can use a separate timepiece to do this, or separate phone. If you're using your phone as your primary tool for the conversation virtually, please use a separate timepiece to keep time. But you simply need a stopwatch. You can simply use your phone function to do that, to keep time so that each participant knows their time and you can announce that to them. As a facilitator, you also help to observe the times of silence. There's typically 1 minute of silence between the rounds. Not between each person speaking, but only after the entire first round, there's a minute of silence. After the second full round, there's another minute of silence. During these minutes of silence, you help to set up the next round. You'll say, for instance, we'll now have a minute of silence. So you might consider what resounded within you during this first round, what moved you, and you'll have an opportunity to speak to that in the second round. So you help people to really set up their moment of reflection to prepare for the second round. Facilitators can also act as the note takers. Again, note takers could be a separate function, and you could have a separate note taker as well. And sometimes facilitators work in pairs. One will be the facilitator and note taker, and another person timekeeping or in some way dividing these roles. But typically, a facilitator will do all three roles. We'll go over the note-taking function in detail in a few minutes. But just so you know, those notes are only taken during the final rounds of conversation. As another note, participants are encouraged to take notes during the rounds because they'll be asked to speak back what they heard. And sometimes some of us forget a few things that we heard that we want to bring up later. So participants can take personal notes if they want to remember something they want to bring up in the next round. A few other considerations then, as you consider this role of facilitator. First, the first round of conversation always focuses on the individual's own direct and personal experience. We ask about their joys and their sorrows, their challenges. We also ask about their hopes for the future. We believe that everyone is an expert in their own experience. So everyone can share from their experience, and they don't need to be an expert in the particular subject area, but they are an expert in their own experience. And we want to focus on that experience that people are having. Conversations in the Spirit are primarily an exercise in active listening. We listen attentively to others and to their experiences and their stories, and we try to allow them to touch our hearts, to really listen with understanding and compassion to what the other person is trying to say to us. We're not expected in these conversations as facilitators or as participants to solve any problems or to defend any positions. We're not here to do that kind of work. We're not here to win the conversation either. We're just here to listen deeply to what others are sharing and respond to that in kind. Facilitators also create a sacred space. Participants are invited to enter into this space with reverence and to be open to the presence of God in their midst. We open our conversations with a meditation or an Ignatian examen that help people think through the questions one last time as a final preparation. We want these spaces to also be safe spaces, spaces where people don't feel that they're attacked, where they're respected in the conversation, where the contents of the conversation are kept confidential, and where people are not judged or criticized through their sharing. You help to establish that and ensure that this is a safe space for everyone. There is an opportunity in a virtual space where everyone can hit that big red button that says leave meeting. If someone feels triggered within a conversation, you must be prepared as a facilitator that they could leave at any moment. Sometimes they leave because of a technological issue, where people just disappear because they lose their Wi-Fi, for instance. Or people could feel triggered because of the tension or conflict that emerges in the conversation. It happens very rarely, but as a facilitator, you must be prepared for someone dropping out of the conversation in a virtual environment and how you're going to continue to carry on with the conversation if you do lose a participant, which of course is always unfortunate. Finally, these conversations in the Spirit are not places for debating or defending or arguing. These are not arguments. They're listening sessions to listen with one another and to work collaboratively. We're not here to correct others or to teach others, even if that's well-intentioned. Even if it's what we'll call pastoral correction. This is not the place for it. It's just a time to listen deeply to how other people are understanding themselves and their experience. We'll get to catechesis, we'll get to teaching when we reflect on these conversations and where people are at. But right now is just a time for listening. You and others in the conversation are also not expected to counsel others. There may be times when people share experiences that are very, very deep and oftentimes painful. You're not expected to make other people feel better, and you're not expected to counsel them in their situations. That's not your role. Your role is simply to hold them, to make them feel safe and comfortable in that sharing. All right, so let's talk about some facilitator tips for situations that you might run into as a facilitator. These are sort of the top situations, the most common situations that you'll find. We have a few clips here from our facilitator, Tony, who will demonstrate how to address some of these situations. So let's go through the top and most common situations that you will come across as a facilitator. First of all, the most common thing that you'll come across as a facilitator, either virtually or in person, is people that would exceed their time limits, that they continue talking even after you've given them a 30-second warning and told them that their time is finished, that they just keep on talking. So how do you deal with this situation in a way which is polite and respectful and yet effective in having them conclude their thoughts so that others have their full amount of time? Here's Tony giving one example from our facilitator tips and guides that you might try to use.
You know, like giving our input or our feedback,
Ariel,
which is
thank
just
you.
really...
I need to stop you so that everybody gets a chance to be able to speak. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Tony. You might also consider, as you think about being a facilitator, whether you'd use a line like Tony had used, or what you might say to someone if that situation occurs. And you might just have that in your back pocket, just as a polite and simple way to let people know that their time is finished and we need to move on. The next situation that you'll run into are people that are interrupting one another, or what we call crosstalk. This can be very distracting when people have been told that they'll have an uninterrupted amount of time to speak as one of the primary ground rules. Again, here's Tony, who will demonstrate one way that you might address someone interrupting someone else as they're speaking.
Everybody gets a chance to be able to speak. Okay, thank you.
So for me, I think the sense of tying into community, I appreciate what Joseph said.
Thanks, Tony. So again, you might consider what you would say, what is most comfortable for you to, again, politely and yet clearly let people know that interrupting the conversation is not acceptable. Usually if this happens one time and you correct someone, everyone else in the conversation clearly understands it, and it usually only happens once. Most people always do abide by the ground rules, but you just need to be prepared for the situation when it does occur. All right, on to the next one. This is one that you really can't change or address directly, but you should be aware that it's happening, and you might be able to redirect the conversation if it does begin to happen. This is what we call non-experiential inputs. The very first question in the first round of conversation is always around people's experience. We want them to tell a story from their own life, to root it deeply in their experience so they don't get stuck in their head in an ideological or theological diatribe at times, where they're not speaking deeply from their own experience. When this happens, you kind of have to let it happen. There's no way to cut people off or to stop them. And this is where many people feel most comfortable, is in their heads. You might, though, change just make an amendment or a comment at the end, just to remind people that we're speaking from our experience. The next situation commonly happens often with pastoral leaders in the conversation who feel that it's important for them as catechists or as religious leaders to correct other people if they say something that might be slightly off kilter from the actual catechism of the church. Again, this is not a moment to correct or to judge others, but simply to listen, to try to understand where they're coming from and how God is moving in their life. We will use these reflections later as church leaders begin to discuss how to respond to the current situations. But right now, we're really just trying to understand where people are coming from, how they understand themselves, and how they understand God working within their life. When pastoral corrections happen, it's important to remind people that we're here just to listen and not to pass judgment. The next situation that oftentimes happens because of the sensitivity of the questions we're asking are strong emotions, or sometimes people becoming upset as they're expressing their emotions and their experiences. You certainly want to be supportive of people and let them know that you're there as a compassionate presence, but you also need to ensure that the conversation continues to keep moving. Finally, you might consider all of these situations together and how you might respond to each one or other situations that are coming. You should feel natural and comfortable within your role and be clear of the ground rules and what they are, and that your primary role as facilitator is to ensure that those ground rules are upheld throughout the conversation. And you can find more about these in the Facilitator Tips PDF that's included as a resource with this course. Next, let's talk about note-taking. Note-taking happens after the final round of conversation. While everyone within the conversation, and you yourself, might even take a few notes to remember some things through the conversation, the real report that will be shared with others, with the leaders of the community or moved on in the life of the church, happens only in the last round. After all of the conversations have happened, round 1, 2, and 3, you'll then be asked to take some notes and to work together with the group to develop that report that will be shared on. We've provided a note-taking form that you can use and adapt for your conversation in the Spirit. This is a simple Google form, but we encourage you to use this form because it will immediately transmit the information back to the organizers of the conversation. So the first thing that you'll want to do at the end of the conversation is to open up that notes form. Now, you can do this actually before the conversation even begins. You can have this open as a window on your computer. Again, of course, I'm speaking just for those in a virtual conversation. But you want to open up that notes form, and I would do it before the conversation even starts, just to have it there and ready on your Zoom screen. So we're all working together collaboratively at this point. Remember, we're moving from I to we. This is the ultimate moment of we, where we're working together as a small group to create a report that accurately represents the content of the conversation and the conclusions that we seem to be coming to. The consensus report has 3 different aspects to it. The first is identifying common themes, or what we call convergences. A convergence is a common theme that has emerged through the conversation, but they can also be themes that weren't there at the beginning of the conversation, but seem to emerge as the conversation moved forward. Everyone kept coming back to this agreement around a common theme that seemed to emerge through the conversation. So where did our thoughts converge with one another? The next point, though, that you want to take up are divergences. So where were different points of opinion? Where did our thoughts diverge from one another, where we had different points of view? It's important to record those, and it's important to understand that we don't need to come to agreement on all points in our conversation. We don't need to come to an easy fix where we all come to a common understanding at the end. That may not happen. That's not always realistic. There may be different points of view that we hold on to throughout the conversation, and even at the end of the conversation, those different points of view, those divergent points, still exist. We want to record those different points of view so that no one's ideas are left out. But we'll want to ask everyone in the conversation, what were those different points of view so that we can articulate them clearly. Finally, the third point are recommendations or actions. The Holy Spirit tends to move us towards action, towards some response to the situations that are occurring in our lives, in our communities, and in our world. Are there certain recommendations that we want to move forward on how the church should respond to particular situations or to the overall topic of the conversation? I'd encourage you to seek agreement with everyone before finalizing the report, so that everyone agrees that this is an accurate representation of the major points of the conversation. As you do this, you'll want to share your screen if you're in a Zoom environment. Share your screen with everyone in that conversation so they can see clearly what you've written down on their behalf. This leads to ultimate transparency within the conversation so that all can see what you're going to send in and everyone agrees to your report. Often the small group conversations in the Spirit that you'll be asked to facilitate are part of a wider conversation event. So an assembly or in a gathering, often in a virtual environment, where many people come together in a Zoom room and then are broken into smaller breakout rooms where you'll be the facilitator for one of those small groups. So what I'd like to do is review the agenda of a virtual conversation event so that you understand what will happen in the large group before your small group facilitation occurs and what will happen after that small group ends. So you can see how your conversation is part of this wider event. So if you imagine a large Zoom room where people come in, it could be 100-200 people that gather into the room together. When they come in, there's a leader of that conversation who welcomes everyone to the event and probably has an opening prayer or song that really gathers people into the event. The next thing that'll happen is an introduction to the conversation in the Spirit process and a reading of the ground rules, just like the same ground rules that we looked at earlier. Everyone is asked to affirm those ground rules by raising their hand, either virtually or literally raising their hand, to say that they affirm those ground rules and that they will abide by those ground rules in the conversation. This gives you then permission as the facilitator to hold people accountable. After the ground rules are read, there'll be a reading of the primary questions for round one of the conversation. They'll then be asked to share on these questions, but everyone knows this ahead of time, but this is just a formal reading of those primary questions. After those questions are read, there's then an Ignatian examen or a time of meditation where people are asked to think through these questions. The presumption is that they've been preparing for this for a while, but let's be honest, sometimes people don't have a lot of time to prepare. So this gives people some space to prepare for the conversation before they come into it. After the examen is complete, that's when we'll move into the small group environment. So everyone will be told that they'll be put into a small group. These may be language-specific groups. So it's very simple to hold small groups in multiple languages. So if you're a facilitator working in a particular language, you'll also be aware of that, and everyone in that group will be speaking that language. But in general, you'll be put into a small group at that point. You'll announce yourself as the facilitator when you arrive in the group, and all the participants should join you. Again, we try to keep that group to about 5 to 7 people in each and every group. You'll have usually, I said 60 minutes for the conversation. Here it's 75 minutes because we want to leave 10 to 15 minutes at the end for that note-taking and consensus process. We found that 60 minutes is just not quite enough time to finish the conversation. So we've added on extra time to allow you to take those notes and not feel rushed in the conversation. When people come back from the conversation, and they'll immediately be asked by the leader to share any graces that emerged within the conversation. At the end, after we have the naming of the graces process, the leader of the conversation will announce what's happening next, that all of the facilitators will submit these reports, that these reports will go to the leader of the organization, and that some next step will follow. There'll be some reporting back, there'll be goals that emerge from this, that there will be some response from leadership as a result of this conversation. And the leader of the large group in the virtual environment will share what those next steps are. The last thing that happens is just to thank everyone for being a part of that conversation, and there'll be a closing prayer. I hope that this second session on the role of the facilitator has given you an understanding of what the facilitator does within the conversation and what the dynamics of the conversation are and your responsibilities within it. In the next section, we'll have an opportunity to watch a demonstration conversation, what we call a fishbowl conversation, where one of our facilitators from Ignatian Encounter Ministry will be joined by 4 participants who will go through a shortened version of the conversation. As you watch that conversation, you'll be asked just to put yourself in the place of our facilitator, Tony, and imagine yourself as the facilitator and what questions might emerge for you or concerns that you might have in being a facilitator. So we'll get to that section next. I look forward to seeing you there.